The conversation ended abruptly. Enzo had listened to it over and over again. He had his own thoughts, but he wanted fresh input. "What do you think?"
"I think they didn't like one another very much," Sophie said.
"Why do you say that?"
"Well, because the killer's being very polite, and the other guy can hardly conceal his irritation."
Bertrand said,
"I'm not sure he's irritated so much as just tense, wary."
Nicole asked if they could listen to it again, and Enzo rewound the tape to replay it. When they finished listening for a second time, Nicole said,
"They don't know one another very well, do they? I think maybe they've met only a handful of times before."
"Why do you say that?"
"Because he had to ask if the other guy knew his address."
Kirsty said,
"They'd obviously met often enough for Lambert to have established that he only wanted them to meet in public."
"So why did he agree to let him come to his home?" It was Raffin this time. Enzo said, "Because the killer was threatening him, very subtly, but unmistakably. He was in complete command of the conversation. He was using the familiar, too, while Lambert was using the formal vous. Lambert was being spoken to like a child. His caller had failed to make some prearranged call the day before, but his apology was perfunctory. When Lambert expressed his preference for a meeting in public, he was slapped right back down. Écoute-moi. Listen, we need to talk. There's more than the hint of a threat in that. We hear Lambert sigh. He doesn't want the caller to come to his house, but he gives in straight away because he's lacking in confidence. He's scared, intimidated." Enzo looked around all the faces focused in his direction. "But there's something else. A single word in that whole conversation that sticks out like a sore thumb." When the faces looking back at him remained blank, he turned to his elder daughter. "Come on, Kirsty. English is your native tongue. You must have heard it, surely." Kirsty stiffened, feeling the weight of her father's expectation. She had never been quite sure that it was something she could live up to. She desperately wanted to please him, but she couldn't think of anything.
"He said he'd been out of the country, in England, the town of Portsmouth."
He swung his attention towards Bertrand.
"Say Portsmouth, Bertrand."
Bertrand looked at him blankly.
"Just as you would normally."
"Portsmouth," he said. Enzo swiveled back towards Kirsty.
"See? Hear how he said it? The way the French always say it."
And he pronounced it phonetically, just the way that Bertrand had said it.
Portsmouth. The French just cannot get their brains around the concept of 4 consecutive consonants, R-T-S-M. How do you pronounce that? They can't. They say Portsmouth, but his caller pronounced it just the way an Englishman would, Portsmouth.
Kirsty nodded, understanding now what her father had meant.
"Are you saying he was English?" "That's just it. I don't know. He doesn't sound English to me."
He turned to Anna.
"Did he sound like a foreigner to you?"
She shook her head.
"He sounded like a Frenchman to me." "He had a southern accent," Sophie said. "He's French. I'd put money on it."
Enzo smiled and shook his head. He reached for a book he had placed on the shelf beside the stereo. He opened it at a page marked by a post-it. "The Murders in the Rue Morgue," he said, "by Edgar Allan Poe. Let me read you this paragraph." He slipped a pair of half-moon reading glasses onto the end of his nose and perched himself on the arm of Sophie's fauteuil. "The Frenchman supposes it the voice of a Spaniard, and might have distinguished some words had he been acquainted with the Spanish. The Dutchman maintains it to have been that of a Frenchman. But we find it stated that, not understanding French, this witness was examined through an interpreter. The Englishman thinks it the voice of a German, and does not understand German. The Spaniard is sure that it was that of an Englishman, but judges by the intonation altogether, as he has no knowledge of the English. The Italian believes it the voice of a Russian, but has never conversed with a native of Russia. A second Frenchman differs, moreover, with the first, and is positive that the voice was that of an Italian, but not being cognizant of that tongue is, like the Spaniard, convinced by the intonation." He looked up at the array of rueful smiles around him. "Not easy, is it? We all have our own perceptions, very often based on preconceptions which are false." He paused. "You know what a shibboleth is?"
Raffin said, "It's a password." We use it in that sense, yes, but it's the origin of the word that's interesting in this context. It's an old Hebrew word, and its present usage derives from a story told in the old Hebrew Bible, a story of civil war between two Hebrew tribes, the Ephraimites, who have settled on one side of the river Jordan, and the Gileadites, who are settled on the other. If an Ephraimite who crossed the river tried to pass himself off as a friend, the Gileadites would make him pronounce the word shibboleth. It actually meant flooding stream, but in the Ephraimite dialect, initial sh sounds were always pronounced s, so the Ephraimite would say sibboleth and give himself away. Kirsty said, "So Portsmouth is like a shibboleth?" "Exactly. It tells us something very important about our killer. The trouble is, I don't know what." He closed his book and took the cassette from the stereo. He held it up between thumb and forefinger. "But I know a man who might. I need to get this in the post first thing tomorrow." Chapter 30. When Kirsty awoke, there were long slivers of gold slanting through half-opened shutters, and she heard the church bell strike 9. She had lain awake for much of the night, and was surprised now to find that she had slept at all. The bed beside her was empty. She got up, brushing tangled hair from her face, and slipped on her dressing-gown, padding then in bare feet across polished boards to open the French windows and throw the shutters wide. The sun, still low in the sky, blinded her, and the rush of ice-cold air shocked her from her drowse. Frost lay thick across the fields, sparkling in the sunlight. Long shadows cut sharp lines across the white-roofed houses of the village. In normal circumstances, a morning like this would have raised her spirits, keening her anticipation of the day ahead, but nothing, it seemed, could lift her out of her depression. The tumultuous events of the last few days, and the death of Sylvie, had settled on her like a fog, laden with guilt and regret, compounded now by the mercurial behaviour of her lover. In the days that he had been away, Roger had neither called nor emailed once, and then, on his return, he had been caring and attentive, making love to her in the afternoon, easing her depression with a balm of soothing words, only to ignore her all through dinner, turning his attentions exclusively towards their hostess. Kirsty knew that everyone else around the table had been aware of it. Nicole had prattled away to Sophie and Bertrand, and they had prattled back, a way of covering their embarrassment, and Kirsty had been conscious of her father's smouldering anger at the far end of the table, but his expected explosion had never come. Kirsty was intimidated by Anna. She felt dowdy and naive by comparison, and she was sure that for the erudite and experienced Roger, Anna's more worldly sophistication cast Kirsty in the shade. She had tried to speak to him about it last night when they went to bed, but he had said that he was tired. It had been a long day. She was just depressed and not seeing things clearly. They would talk about it in the morning. But now that morning was here, he had risen before her, and she wondered if that was a harbinger for a day that would be spent avoiding the issue. She showered and dressed and slipped out into the hallway, filled with trepidation. Light from the windows in the stairwell reflected off dark, polished floorboards, and the spiral wooden staircase curled up and down from the landing, supported by nothing that Kirsty could see. It was attached to the wall on one side, and its banister spiraled around fresh air on the other. A fairy-tale staircase in Kirsty's personal nightmare. It creaked ominously at each step as she made her way down to the hall below. Even as she reached the foot of the stairs, she could hear raised voices in the kitchen. Roger and her father. Curtains half-drawn across the hall obscured the kitchen doorway, and she stood listening, transfixed.
"Oh, piss off, Enzo. You're just jealous."
Enzo's voice was steady, controlled, but Kirsty could hear the tension in it and was shocked by his words.
"Even if I didn't know that Anna thought you were a prick, Raffin, I'd have no cause to be jealous. True enough. Why would you go getting jealous over some whore you picked up in a bar?"
There was a very long, dangerous silence in which the imminent threat of violence had time to recede. Enzo's voice was stretched to breaking point.
"Anna and I owe each other nothing, neither loyalty nor fidelity. We're enjoying each other in the moment. No history, no future, and none of that has any relevance here." "Oh, and what has?" "Kirsty." I think she's made it more than abundantly clear to you that she and I are none of your business, all right? Yes, she has. And that's her choice, her right. Like it or not, I've got to respect that, but I'll not stand by and see her hurt."
Raffin said,
"You're full of shit, you know that? Just stay away from Anna."
There was the sound of something banging onto a worktop, and then a heavy footfall. Kirsty quickly ran down the first few steps of the stairway leading to the cellar, the curve of it hiding her from view as Raffin emerged from the kitchen, pale-faced with anger. He headed upstairs, 2 at a time. Kirsty remained hidden, listening for her father in case he might follow, but after a long silence she heard him moving through to the dining-room, and the sound of the French windows opening onto the terrace. She took several tentative steps back up to the hall and stood in the semi-gloom, nursing mixed feelings. Not so long ago she would have been furious with Enzo. She would have stormed into the kitchen and told him he had no business and no right interfering in her life, but somehow in these last days her perception of him had changed.
"You're up late this morning?"
The voice startled her, and she turned to find Anna standing in the half-open door of the computer room.
"Oh, hi. I guess I slept in."
Anna tilted her head, giving her a curious look, a tiny, empathetic smile curling the corners of her mouth.
"Have you had breakfast? I'm not hungry." "Why don't we go for a walk, then? It's a beautiful morning. Who knows, you might work up an appetite." "I don't think so."
But Anna wasn't taking no for an answer.
"What else are you going to do?"
And when Kirsty couldn't think of a quick reply, Anna took her arm and led her towards the door, stopping only to lift their jackets from the coat-stand. The frost was beginning to melt now on roofs and across the fields where the sunlight lay. The garden was spread out before them, sparkling and wet, a tiny fountain set in a circular flower-bed gurgling through the ice. They walked across the grass, leaving trails through the frost, past the swimming pool and down onto the path that led to the road.
"Where is everyone?"
Kirsty said.
"Sophie and Bertrand have driven down to Aurillac for the day. Nico's got her face stuck in a computer screen, as usual."
She glanced back towards the house and saw Raffin watching them from the balcony outside his bedroom. On the terrace at the side of the house, Enzo was leaning on the rail, following their progress. Neither man could see the other. Anna slipped her arm through Kirsty's.
"You don't like me very much, do you?"
Kirsty drew away.
"What do you mean?" "Some woman your father picked up in a bar. A one-night stand. What sort of woman could that be? Certainly not good enough for him."
Kirsty said,
"It takes 2 to make a one-night stand, and from all accounts it wouldn't be untypical of my father."
No sooner were the words out of her mouth than she immediately regretted them. That was the old Kirsty talking. Her father had believed he was dying. She had no right to judge him. But Anna just grinned.
"The young are such prudes.
One set of values for themselves, another for their parents. But actually it was me that did the picking up. If I hadn't, I doubt your father would even have noticed me. He was pretty preoccupied. I was in Strasbourg for the funeral of a friend and feeling a bit low. It was more about comfort than sex, for both of us."
"And now?"
Anna twinkled.
"Oh, now it's definitely the sex."
Which made Kirsty laugh for the first time in days. They walked on in silence until they reached the road that ran through the village. A monument in front of the church listed the dead of the Great War. Even in a tiny village like this, the death toll had reached nearly 40, wiping out a whole generation of its young men. Bruce, Chanou, Clavière, Torrent, Vore, Verdier.
"So what's the story, Kirsty?" "What story?" "Between you and your father." "He hasn't told you?" "We're still strangers in the night, Kirsty. We make love, not conversation."
And Kirsty felt overshadowed again by the older woman's easy wit and sophistication. It made her behaviour through all the years of rejecting her father seem childish and inconsequential, and she glossed over it.
"Oh, he left my mother for another woman when I was just a kid. He set up home here in France with his French lover, and then she went and died in childbirth, leaving him to bring up Sophie on his own. And you resented him for it? I didn't understand why he'd gone. It was like it wasn't my mother he was leaving, it was me. At first I thought it was my fault. Me and Mum used to row all the time. I thought I'd driven him away. Then my mum made me see it wasn't my fault, or hers. It was just my dad. That's how he was. He didn't care about anything or anyone but himself. There were tables and chairs on the terrace outside Chez Milieu, and they sat down to soak up what little warmth there was in the sun. An old man came out and took their order for coffee. Kirsty examined the backs of her hands, avoiding Anna's eye. It took me nearly 20 years to understand that it wasn't that simple. That dads suffer too, and that you can't choose who you love and who you don't. Which made her wonder about Roger, the feelings she had for him, and why, in spite of everything, she still had. She lifted her eyes to meet Anna's. Anyway, we've had a kind of father-daughter rapprochement of late. I think I understand him better now, which makes it easier to forgive. And I suppose I never really realised how much I loved him until I first met Sophie and saw how she doted on him. She smiled. He's difficult and cranky and brilliant, and after all the years I had to do without him, I don't know how I'd survive without him now. Anna gazed off towards some distant, unseen horizon, then snapped back to the moment as their coffees arrived. We never can imagine how we'll survive without the ones we love, she said, until we have to. She turned her gaze directly on the younger woman. And then we just do. And there was something cold in her tone, like the touch of icy fingers. When they finished their coffees, they walked on to the far end of the village before turning back. It took nearly 15 minutes to get back to the house. They heard the phone as they were passing the swimming pool, and when the ringing stopped, they heard Nicole calling for Enzo. They had reached the foot of the steps by the time they heard him return her call. He was coming down the stairs when they came through the front door. Nicole was waiting for him in the hall and handed him the phone. "It's Monsieur Martineau." Enzo took the phone as Raffin appeared on the curve of the staircase above him. "Allô? Oui, bonjour, monsieur. I didn't expect to hear from you so soon." He listened intently for a few moments, and Kirsty saw his expression change. "Well, that's wonderful. When do you think we can expect some kind of feedback?" His expression changed again, and she saw his skin flush dark. "The British? Well, who is he?" As he listened, his expression altered once more, this time to one of incredulity. "Monsieur? That is simply not possible. Well, do we have a name and address?" He waved his hand at Nicole, who grabbed a pen and notepad from the hall table. He cradled the phone between neck and shoulder and scribbled on the top leaf. "There has to be some mistake. Will you check it out?" His face lapsed into resignation. "Okay, well, thank you, Monsieur Martineau. I'll see what I can find out myself." He pressed the end call button, but still held on to the phone, lost in thought. Raffin came down the rest of the stairs. "Well?" Enzo came out of his trance. "It seems that the system put in place by the Prüm Convention works better than I had hoped. Once it was cleared by the brass at the Quai des Orfèvres, they were able to run our man's DNA through all 27 European databases. And—" Nicole could barely contain her excitement. "They found a match in the NDNAD. That's the UK national database." Raffin looked at him. "But the man whose DNA profile matches our killer's was serving a prison sentence in England at the time of Lambert's murder." Nicole said, "That's not possible," echoing Enzo's own words of just a few moments later. "There must have been a mistake." "Apparently not. They were an exact match. And here's the thing. A DNA profile consists of 20 numbers and a gender indicator. The probability of the DNA profiles of two unrelated individuals matching is, on average, less than 1 in 1 billion. Chapter 31. London, England, October 1986. The apartment building was at the south end of Clapham High Street, not far from the green open spaces of the Common. It was a 6-storey block with a pebble dash facing, built in the 1930s.
During a recent renovation, rusted Art Deco windows had been replaced by double-glazed units that kept the heat in and the noise out. Unwelcome visitors were kept out too by a door entry system that required a 6-digit code. The nearest station was Clapham Common, and you could be in central London within 30 minutes. Richard sat in a cafe across the street, wondering what it must feel like to live in a place like that. To have a flat you could call your own, money in your pocket, parents you could telephone when you were in trouble. He wondered what Christmases must have been like in his family. Very different, he imagined, from those he had spent alone with his mother in the house on the cliffs. She had done her best, with decorations and a Christmas stocking. She had showered him with presents he didn't want, a vain attempt to win his affections. But it was always just them, and he got bored. If she had friends or relatives, they never came, never called. She never watched TV, preferring to sit and read, driving him to his bedroom, where he spent solitary hours nursing his resentment of the good time he knew his friends from school would be having. He couldn't finish his coffee. It was weak and milky, and no amount of sugar would give it flavour. He liked his coffee strong and black. Real coffee. He couldn't get used to the way the English served it. Powder from a jar, drowned in milk. In the street outside he was assaulted by the roar of the traffic and waited at the lights until he could cross. There was a red pillar box on the corner where people posted letters, and he lit a cigarette and leaned against it, pretending to read the copy of the Evening Standard that he had bought in the newsagents. From here he had a clear view of the entrance to the apartments, and could make it in 30 seconds if he chose. He watched a middle-aged couple emerge and head north along the high street, and then a young man in a great hurry, who took the steps to the door 2 at a time before Richard had time to intercept him. It was nearly an hour before the perfect opportunity presented itself. A young woman, who could have been no more than 25 or 26, hesitated at the foot of the steps, juggling several bags of shopping. She retrieved a slip of paper from her purse, and by the time she reached the door, Richard was right behind her. He could see the code written in a neat hand as she fumbled to try to punch it in. She must have been new, the number not yet committed to memory. She dropped a bag, and onions spilled down the steps. Richard stooped quickly to retrieve them and pop them back in the bag. She flushed with embarrassment. "Thanks." He handed her the bag. "Hi, how are you doing?" he said, as if he knew her. "Why don't you let me do that?" And he punched in the number he had just read over her shoulder. "I'm so clumsy," she said, and pushed the door open with her foot as the buzzer sounded. He held it open for her so that she could go through into the lobby. There were post-boxes all along one wall, and an elevator at the far end of the hall. "You're on the 4th floor, aren't you? I've seen you before in the lift." "That's right," Richard said, "and I never forget a pretty face." She blushed, this time with pleasure, as they squeezed together into the intimate space of the elevator. "You haven't been here long?" he said. "No, just a couple of weeks." "You're really going to have to work at remembering that number." "Oh, I know. I've just never made the effort. Stupid, isn't it? I can never remember it when friends are coming round and they ask for the code." The elevator jerked to a halt on the 4th floor, and Richard stepped out into the hallway. "See you around, I hope." "Yeah, I hope so, too." The doors slid shut, and Richard looked along the length of the corridor. He had no idea which door it was, and walked quickly along, checking each nameplate. Bright was second from the end. He stopped outside the door and listened for a moment, although he was certain the apartment was empty. He drew out a long, stout screwdriver from inside his jacket, inserting it between the door and the architrave and levering it several times until the wood splintered and the lock gave way. He stood perfectly still, holding his breath, listening for any sign that he had been heard before opening the door and slipping quickly inside. He closed it behind him and leaned against it, taking deep, steady breaths to calm himself. He was standing in a short hallway. 2 doors opened to the left, one to a bedroom, the other to a kitchen. There was a toilet at the far end. To the right a door opened into a living dining room with windows overlooking the high street. Richard had the oddest sense of familiarity. He had never been here, and yet felt strangely at home. A calm descended on him, and he went into the bedroom. The bed had not been made. The shape of a head was still pressed into the pillow. The stale smell of sleep, of spent air and sweat, made him think of the bedroom in which he had slept and dreamed and masturbated his whole life. He opened the wardrobe. Men's shirts and jackets, overcoats and trousers hung untidily from the rail. There were T-shirts and sweats and hoodies folded on the shelves, shoes on the rack along the bottom, leather shoes and sports shoes, a pair of Doc Martens. He dropped his bag on the bed and stripped to his underwear and tried on several shirts. They fit, as if he had bought them himself. A pair of jeans were slightly loose on him, but he found belts in a drawer and tried on a couple of suits. Perfect. There was a suitcase on top of the wardrobe. He took it down and opened it on the bed, then turned to the wardrobe and began systematically lifting out clothes to pack. He wouldn't need to buy any for quite some time. In the kitchen he found cans of beer in the refrigerator and opened one, taking large mouthfuls as he wandered through to the living room. The remains of a carry-out pizza were still in its box on the table, along with 2 empty cans of beer. The tabletop was stained with the countless rings left by cans and glasses and mugs. There was a huge TV set in one corner, a futon drawn up in front of it. There were more empty beer cans lined along the windowsills and on top of the television. The shag-pile carpet was littered with the debris of life, crumbs and clothes and cigarette ash, and Richard wondered fastidiously if anyone had ever passed a vacuum cleaner over it. A brand-new Amstrad computer with green phosphor screen stood on a cluttered desk pushed against the far wall. Richard slid open the top drawer and smiled as his eyes fell on the gold-crested blue cover of a British passport. He hesitated, almost savouring the moment. It was who he would be from now on. He picked it up and felt its texture between his fingers, before opening it to look at himself, smiling up from a photograph stamped with the official seal of the United Kingdom Passport Agency. Chapter 32. Clapham High Street hadn't changed much in the 22 years since Richard Bright had been there, although Enzo remembered it from earlier than that. He had stayed in a bedsit off Clapham Common for 4 months in 1978 during his 4-month training attachment to the Metropolitan Police Forensic Science Lab. It felt strange being back, revisiting what had been little more than a fleeting moment in his life. He had been someone else then, and he found it hard to remember the gauche young Enzo, fresh from his 1-year master's in forensic science, a Scottish fish out of water in the great big London pond. The cafe hadn't changed much either since the half-hour Bright had spent in it in 1986, sipping at a milky coffee he would never finish. But Enzo wasn't to know that. If the cafe had been there in Enzo's day, he had no recollection of it. What remained true was that it still provided a perfect view of the apartment block across the street. He sat at a table in the window, a bitter, black, watery coffee in front of him. He had known to ask for his coffee black, but had forgotten how bad it would be, and wished he had ordered tea instead. Kirsty sat opposite, sipping a Diet Coke. She was more freshly acquainted with British bad taste. He still heard Sophie whining in his ear, begging him to take her with him. That she was becoming more jealous of her half-sister was clear, and she didn't want to hear it when Enzo explained that the only reason he would risk taking Kirsty was because she could identify the man from Strasbourg. If, indeed, the man whose London address Martineau had given him was the same one, which was a long way from certain. They had lunched in the cafe and spent much of the afternoon there, watching the comings and goings across the street. There had been quite a few, but no one remotely resembling the man who had picked Kirsty off the floor in the Palais des Congrès. Enzo was finding it hard to contain his impatience. He had checked the nameplates when they first got there, and now he wanted simply to cross the road and press the buzzer marked Bright. But if this really was their man, then he would be putting Kirsty, as well as himself, at risk. He looked up to find Kirsty watching him. "Whatever happened with you and Charlotte?" she said out of the blue. Enzo made a moue with his lips. He had met Charlotte when he first began his investigations into the murders in Raffin's book. She had been in the throes of breaking up with Raffin at the time, and Raffin had never forgiven him for getting into a relationship with her. "Charlotte's a free spirit, Kirsty. She's happy to sleep with me, but doesn't want a relationship. I was happy to sleep with her, but I wanted more." "It's over, then?" "With Charlotte, I never know. Roger says she's a real bitch." "She speaks well of Roger, too." In fact, she'd told Enzo that there was something dark about Raffin, Something beyond touching, something you wouldn't want to touch even if you could. He wanted to tell her that, but didn't, and Kirsty didn't pursue it. Instead, she said, "And Anna?" "I like her a lot, Kirsty. I know you don't approve." He raised a hand to preempt her objections. "But that night in Strasbourg, we were both, pretty low. It was good for each of us." "She told me. You thought you were dying. She'd just come from a funeral." Enzo shook his head. "No, she'd been visiting her parents, and they'd given her a hard time." Kirsty looked at him. "That's not what she told me. She said she'd just been at the funeral of a friend." Enzo shrugged and contemplated another sip of coffee, but decided against it. "Maybe she'd been at a funeral too. Doesn't really matter. The fact is that our paths crossed, and I'm not sorry that they did." He looked up to see Kirsty staring out of the window, her face pale, fear frozen in her eyes. "What is it?" He turned to see a man standing on the other side of the glass, cupping his hands around a cigarette to light it. He had close-cropped fair hair and wore a dark Crombie overcoat. "It's him." Her voice was barely a whisper. "He just got off the bus." If there had not been a window between them, she could have reached out and touched him. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely certain. I'd know him anywhere." The bus moved away and he turned towards them, blowing smoke at the window. He was looking straight at them. Enzo heard the panic in Kirsty's voice. "Dad, he's seen us!" But a hand went up to smooth back his ruffled hairline, and he inclined his head slightly to one side, lifting his jaw. And Enzo realized that he didn't see them at all. He was looking at his own reflection in the glass, and then, as he turned away, Enzo heard Kirsty gasp. "Oh, my God!" He looked at her, concerned. "What?" The man was starting to cross the road. "I don't think it is him. I mean, it can't be." "How's that possible? You were absolutely certain just a moment ago." "The man in Strasbourg was missing his right earlobe. I told you that. The same as the man in the hairdressers in Cahors. But that man's ear is intact. Just as he turned away from the window, I could see it quite clearly, earlobe and all." "Jesus," Enzo said suddenly, "that explains everything. Come on." And he grabbed her hand, and they ran from the cafe. They could see the man in the Crombie overcoat climbing the steps to the door of the apartment block, but the traffic lights were at green and they couldn't get across. Then there was a break, and Enzo dragged Kirsty between the cars to a chorus of horns, and they reached the far sidewalk just as the man was punching numbers into the door entry system. By the time they were running up the steps, the door was swinging shut and nearly closed. Enzo caught it before the lock engaged and pushed it wide. The man was entering the elevator at the far end of the hall. "William Bright!" The man put his hand between the doors to stop them closing, and took a half-step out as Enzo and Kirsty ran up the hall. "Who the hell are you?" Kirsty felt a chill of fear run through her, but he looked at them both, without recognition. Enzo tried to catch his breath. "My name's Enzo MacLeod. I need to talk to you, Mr. Bright, about your family. Just a few minutes of your time." Bright's apartment on the 4th floor was small, a typical bachelor pad, cluttered and untidy. "Excuse the mess. Cleaner doesn't come till tomorrow." He held the door open for them. "Go on through to the living room. I'll be with you in a minute." The living room floor was piled high with books. A small gate-leg dining table was stacked with cardboard boxes. There was a huge plasma TV mounted on the wall, and a couple of recliners positioned for watching it. They heard the toilet flush, and the faucet running. Then Bright came into the room and looked around it with sad resignation. He seemed to feel the need to explain. "Half this stuff isn't mine. Been letting it for years. Had to give the last tenant notice when my bloody wife kicked me out. I've only just moved back in." He found Kirsty staring at him with an odd intensity and turned to Enzo. "So, what can I do for you people?" "You spent 9 months in prison in 1992, after a brawl in a nightclub." "Jesus Christ, what are you, cops?" "I'm a forensic scientist, Mr. Bright, investigating a murder." Bright shook his head. "I never killed the guy." "I know that. Just beat him unconscious." "It was self-defense, a bloody miscarriage of justice." "Then you were rearrested 12 years later
on suspicion of dealing drugs, and never charged. What the fuck is it you want, mister? Maybe you weren't charged, but they held you for questioning for 12 hours, during which time they took a DNA swab from the inside of your mouth. I don't know if you're aware of it, but from that time on, your DNA has been held in the UK National DNA Database. So what? That's how we found you. A sample of DNA recovered from a crime scene in France was a perfect match with a sample you provided the British police. Bright frowned. That's not possible. I've never even been to France. Then he paused. What crime scene? The murder I'm investigating. Bright laughed in their faces. Got fuck all to do with me. I never murdered anyone. I know that, Mr. Bright. You were in prison here in the UK when the murder was committed. Then you couldn't have found my DNA. But we did. Bright was shaking his head. Not possible. Enzo drew a deep breath. Do you have a twin, Mr. Bright? No. Enzo was momentarily discomposed. Are you sure? Of course I'm fucking sure. I'd know if I had a twin, wouldn't I? Then he paused and pulled a face, and waved a dismissive hand towards no one in particular. Well, okay, technically maybe I did. Once, I mean. I did have a twin brother. But he's dead. Has been for nearly 40 years. Enzo stared at him, wondering how that was possible. Explain. Bright pushed his hands in his pockets and wandered away towards the window. Jesus, I don't even know that I want to tell you people about it. He pressed his forehead against the glass and looked down into the street below. It's something I never think about. Christ, I can't even remember him. His breath exploded in little patches of condensation. He closed his eyes, and it seemed as if he had been somehow transported to another place, that his spirit had left the room and only the body remained. Then his eyes snapped open, and he turned to face them. We were on holiday in Spain, July 1972. A place called Cadaqués, on the Costa Brava. My parents, my sister, my twin brother and me. They used to put us to bed in our hotel room before they went down to eat every night. The hotel had a babysitting service that was supposed to keep an eye on us. A small explosion of air escaped his lips. Fat lot of fucking good they were. My folks came back up one night to find blood all over the place and Ricky was gone. Your brother? Yeah. We were about 20 months old at the time. Me and Lucy, that's my older sister, never heard a thing. Turned out the blood wasn't Ricky's. But he was never found. No one ever knew who took him or why. So what made you think he was dead? The cops. After about 3 months, they gave up. Told my folks he was almost certainly a goner. Of course, my mother never believed it. He looked at them and shook his head. She's still there, you know. Couldn't bring herself to leave, as long as there was a chance Ricky was alive and might come back. Kept us there too, Luce and me. It's where I grew up. Speak Spanish like a native, for all the fucking good it does me. Enzo stared at the strangely sad face of the twin who'd been deprived of his brother, and felt all the hairs stand up on the back of his neck. I don't know whether this is good news or bad, Mr. Bright, but your brother's not dead. William Bright said nothing, simply stared back at Enzo as if he had just seen a ghost. Enzo said, Only identical twins share identical DNA, which means that when you were in prison here in England in 1992, your twin brother was murdering a male prostitute in a Paris apartment, and he's still very much alive today. All colour had drained from Bright's face. He opened a pack of cigarettes with trembling fingers and lit one. I need a drink, he said, and he went through to the kitchen to get a can of beer from the refrigerator. They heard the fizz of the can opening, and Bright came back, clutching it in an unsteady hand. He took a long pull at the beer, then dragged on his cigarette. His mouth curled into an expression of something like anger. So it was fucking Ricky that nicked my passport. Enzo frowned. What do you mean? It was years ago, sometime in the mid-80s. Not that long after I came back from Spain. It was a real fucking mystery, never forgotten it. What happened? I stayed with my old man for a while when we first got back, then he set me up with this place. Couldn't believe my luck. 18 years old and I had my own private knocking shop. He said it was a good investment. Bloody right. He's worth a fortune now. He blew cigarette smoke at the ceiling. So I came in one night to find the place had been broken into. Bastard nicked half my clothes, credit cards, passport. But this is the weird bit. When the cops talked to the other residents, this girl 2 floors up said I came in with her that day and that we'd shared the lift on the way up. He looked at Enzo. But that was impossible. I was in Ilford, a party at my dad's place. I think the cops thought I was trying to pull some kind of insurance scam. But it wasn't me. I had a dozen witnesses to place me on the other side of town. He paused. Must have been Ricky. He shrugged his consternation. What the hell would he want with my passport? Enzo said, Your identity. And he knew that if he was to solve Lambert's murder, he was going to have to go back another 22 years to find out who abducted a little boy from a coastal resort in northern Spain. Chapter 33. The light was fading fast when they emerged from the apartment block onto the steps. There was a fine cold mist in the air making halos around the streetlights. The traffic, like cholesterol, was clogging the artery that was Clapham High Street, belching carbon monoxide into air, fibrillating with the sound of petrol and diesel engines. Kirsty said, So now you know who he is? But Enzo shook his head. We know who he was 38 years ago, a little boy abducted from a holiday hotel in Spain. We've no idea who he became, or who he is now. You said he'd stolen his brother's identity. Sometime in the 80s, yes, for however long it suited him then. But it would be no long-term solution to take on the identity of another living person. Too risky. So we're not really any further on at all? Yes. We know what he looks like, Kirsty. We know that the man you encountered at the Palais de Congrès in Strasbourg is the man who killed Lambert, the man who tried to kill you, and who murdered Adeline Pomereux in Cahors. From the tape in Lambert's answering machine, we know that he speaks French with a southern accent, speaks it like a native, which means he probably grew up there. What we don't know is who, or exactly where he was all those years. So how do we find out? By going back 38 years to a hotel room in Spain to find out who took him, and where they went. Enzo felt Kirsty's fingers tighten around his arm. Dad! He barely heard her above the roar of the traffic. He turned. What? But her gaze was transfixed. She was staring straight ahead of her, almost as if trapped in some demonic trance. Enzo followed her eye line, and as a truck cleared his line of sight, he saw, standing on the sidewalk on the far side of the street, the man they had just left in the apartment 4 floors up. But it couldn't be him. Enzo felt a chill run down his back like a trail of cold fingers. He shivered. He was looking straight at Lambert's killer, the man who had murdered Adeline Pomereux and tried to kill his daughter, and the man was looking straight back at him. For a moment Enzo lost all reason, an irresistible surge of anger robbing him of both fear and rationale. He tore his arm free of Kirsty's grasp and leapt down the steps to the sidewalk. He heard her calling after him. A taxi driver leaned on his horn as it seemed that he would plunge out into the flow of traffic, and he was forced to stop on the curve as a bus thundered past, the air it displaced nearly knocking him from his feet. When it cleared his vision, Ricky Bright, or whatever he might call himself now, was gone. People in coats and scarves stood in a line at the bus stop. Others, with collars turned up, huddled against the cold and moved in rush-hour streams in either direction, silhouettes against the brightly lit shop fronts opposite. Now Kirsty was at his side, clutching his arm again, her voice insistent. "For God's sake, Dad, what are you doing?" And as his first flush of anger subsided, fear rushed in to fill the void. "Jesus, Kirsty, I don't know. I must be off my head." He turned to look at her. "He knows we know. We're in more danger now than ever." The platform of the underground station at Clapham Common was jammed with rush-hour commuters. They were heading back into the city on the Northern Line. Their train, preceded by a blast of warm air, screeched to a halt with a penetrating squeal of brakes. Doors slid open, spewing people onto the already overcrowded strip of concrete. War broke out as passengers fought to get on and claim their place. Enzo and Kirsty were carried along by the flow, squeezing into an impossibly small space between the doors and those who had got in ahead of them.
A buzzer sounded, and the doors slid shut. The train jerked, throwing everyone off balance, before accelerating into the dark of the tunnel. On the way to the station, Enzo had looked for another glimpse of Bright, turning constantly to check behind him, eyes flickering among the myriad faces that flowed past them like a river in spate. Now he craned to check up and down the carriage. Those who had already claimed seats had faces buried in newspapers and books. Those forced to stand studiously avoided eye contact. Above the roar and rattle of the train, he could hear people sneezing and coughing germs into the fetid air of this winter incubator of flus and colds. And then he saw him. In the next carriage, face pressed against the window of the separating door, making no attempt to conceal himself. He wanted them to know he was there. He wanted them to be afraid. Enzo tugged at Kirsty's arm and nodded towards the following carriage. Her eyes tracked his to meet Bright's, and she turned ghostly white.
"What are we going to do?" "We need to lose him."
"How?"
"I don't know. As long as we're in a crowd, we shall be safe."
But he was thinking of the dark, quiet back streets of Shad Thames behind Butler's Wharf, where they were going to spend the night at Simon's apartment. Simon was still tied up by his court case in Oxford, but had emailed them to say they could pick up the keys from a neighbour and use the place in his absence. Enzo knew they would have to try to lose Bright before they changed at Cannon Street to board the train for Tower Bridge. He watched the names of the stations glide past as they pulled up, one by one, breathing out passengers, sucking in others, and then moved on to the next: Kennington, Elephant and Castle, Borough. London Bridge was the last stop before Cannon Street, where they would have to negotiate a labyrinth of foot tunnels to get to the Monument Tube station on the Circle and District line. He checked to see that Bright was still there, then whispered to Kirsty.
"We'll get off here, wait till we see him on the platform, and then jump back on just before the doors close."
"That won't work."
"Of course it will. I saw it in a film once, and it worked in Cahors."
"There probably wasn't anyone following you in Cahors. And anyway, there are far too many people. There won't be any room to get back on before the doors close." The train jerked and rumbled and swayed into the brightly lit London Bridge station, its platform choked with yet more commuters pressed up against the hoardings, girding themselves for the battle to get aboard. The doors slid apart. Kirsty pushed the hesitating Enzo. "Come on, get off!" And they tumbled out with dozens of others to fight against the oncoming torrent. Enzo strained for a glimpse of Bright above a sea of heads, and there he was, elbowing his way down onto the platform. Enzo turned to grab his daughter, but she was gone. For a moment he panicked, then saw her pushing through the crowds to where two uniformed police officers on terrorist alert stood cradling short, black Heckler & Koch MP5 machine guns. They listened intently as she stopped in front of them, talking fast before turning and pointing back towards Bright. Enzo saw their expressions harden, and they immediately started towards him. One of them shouted, "Hey, you!" The buzzer sounded, warning that the doors were about to close. Bright turned, shouldering his way back into the carriage as the doors shut. Enzo could see the fear in his face. If just one door along the length of the train had been impeded, they would all open again, and he would be caught. But the train juddered and strained, picking up speed out of the station, and Bright allowed himself a tiny, frustrated smile through the glass as it carried him off into the night. The policemen were talking to Kirsty again, and Enzo heard one of them say, "Sorry, miss, all you can do is report it, but I don't suppose it will do much good." She thanked them and turned away towards the exit. Enzo caught up with her on the escalator.
"What did you say to them?"
She looked at her father and grinned. "I told them he'd had his willy out on the train, flashing it at me all the way from Elephant and Castle." They came down the steps from the south end of Tower Bridge, and passed beneath a brick archway into the narrow Shad Thames. Streetlights barely punctured the dark of this ancient walkway between towering warehouses, where once the spoils of empire had been unloaded from the boats docked at Butler's Wharf. Girdered metal bridges ran at peculiar angles overhead. A huge gateway gave on to the Thames itself. In the 19th century, workers had queued here each day in the hope of a few hours' work. Now these vast brick edifices had been converted into luxury apartments, homes for the wealthy, serviced by wine bars and gourmet restaurants whose windows lit up the cobbled lanes. The lights of Pizza Express blazed out in the dark, and they turned past Java Wharf, a freezing fog rolling up from the river, turning people into wraiths and buildings into shadows. It seemed impenetrably dark. A barge sounded its foghorn somewhere out on the water, and the noise of the pubs and restaurants they had left behind receded into the night. Only their own footsteps, echoing back from unseen walls, accompanied them. Enzo put his arm around Kirsty's shoulder and drew her to him for comfort and warmth. She yielded gratefully, letting her head rest on his shoulder. They were both weary and cold, exhausted by fear and apprehension. At the gated entrance to Butler's and Colonial, Enzo tapped in the entry code that Simon had emailed, and they crossed the cobblestones to the entrance of what had once served as a warehouse for storing spices. He remembered Simon telling him that he had toured the building in a hard hat before work began, and that the whole place smelled of cloves. But if the scent of the past still lingered there, then neither Enzo nor Kirsty had been aware of it when they had collected the keys to drop off their bags that morning. Enzo stopped at the gate and made Kirsty turn to face him. She looked wan and tired. He said, "You probably don't remember, but when you were very young, I used to carry you up to bed every night. There was a Crosby and Nash album I was listening to then, and a song on it called Carry Me. I used to sing it to you when I carried you up the stairs." Tears sprung instantly to her eyes. Carry me 'cross the world. Of course she remembered. She just hadn't thought that he would. But all she did was nod. "If I could, I still would. Carry you up the stairs, I mean. But you're too big, and I'm too old." She laughed and laid her head on his chest and put her arms around him. "Oh, shut up, Dad." He grinned, and she took his hand, and they hurried through the gate to the door. Enzo unlocked it, and they stepped gratefully into the warmth of the tiny hall at the foot of a flight of steep, narrow stairs. The ground floor was for parking accessible from the street. Simon's apartment was one up. Kirsty laughed and said, "You'd have had trouble carrying me up these stairs, even 20 years ago." But Enzo stood stock still and raised a quick finger to his lips. Her smile vanished. "What is it?" "I turned all the lights off when we went out this morning." His voice was low and brittle with anxiety. She looked up to see the cold light issuing from the naked yellow bulb hanging in the stairwell, and her eyes drifted upwards to the top landing. "The door's open." Enzo saw that the door to the apartment at the top of the stairs was fractionally ajar. There was a seam of light around two of its edges. He looked about him for a weapon of some kind. A golf umbrella in a coat stand at the foot of the stairs was the only thing to suggest itself. Not much protection against a professional killer. He reached for it all the same and held it in both hands. "Stay here." "No." Her voice was insistent. "This is crazy. We can still get out of here and call the police." He shook his head. "I'm not going to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. There comes a time when you have to confront your fears. If I get into trouble, go for help." "Dad!" But he wasn't listening. He pulled himself free of her grasp and started slowly up the stairs, trying to make as little noise as possible. By the time he reached the landing, he could hear someone moving around inside the apartment, but only just. The sound of blood pulsing through his head was drowning out almost everything else. Very gingerly, he pushed the door open. The long hallway that led to the vast, open-plan space at the far end was in darkness. The light came from an open door leading to one of the bedrooms. A shadow crossed the oblong of light that fell out into the hall, then loomed large as a figure emerged from the doorway. Enzo grasped the umbrella so that he could use its stout wooden handle as a club and raised it level with his head. The figure turned towards him, startled by the movement caught in his peripheral vision. A switch was flicked and the hall flooded with light. Simon stood staring in astonishment at Enzo clutching his golf umbrella. He said, "Is it raining out?"